2006, this woman in her 40s with a ponytail pushed a chalkboard into an alley in Berkeley, California, and presented to a small group of about 20 people about the 5 stages of the materials economy. And for 2 hours, she blasted very distressing facts that she had learned in studying the materials economy. A small group of people were overwhelmed and inspired, because they're all nerds. This small group of people was colleagues of mine at Free Range Studios, and the woman was Annie Leonard from The Story of Stuff.
Of these, I got a little obsessed with mine. In fact, I got a little obsessed with all my stuff.
We took 2 hours of a bunch of data and made it into 20 minutes of a story. How do you break down this big complex thing? This is what we all try to do, especially if you're working in sustainability communications, and actually make it accessible, much less something people could be inspired by.
Have you ever wondered where all the stuff we buy comes from and where it goes when we throw it out? I couldn't stop wondering about that, so I looked it up. And what the textbook said is that stuff moves through a system from extraction to production to distribution to consumption to disposal. All together, it's called the materials economy.
We didn't call it the 5 stages of the materials economy. We call it the story of stuff. We didn't have her come out and go, you're going to be so blown away and distressed by the stuff I've learned in 10 years of studying garbage and being the least impressive and interesting person at every cocktail party. Like, no one wanted to listen to Annie Leonard talk about garbage. She challenged herself to learn how to speak in a new way, to tell stories, essentially. She walks out on the stage, she creates empathy. Do you have one of these? I have one of these. Do you love it? I love it. Guess what? It goes somewhere when you throw it away. And that distressed me. Doesn't it distress you? Let me unpack that. Let me show you that it's actually pretty easy. You can dive into any one of these things, and I'm going to dive into all of those things. So she uses a story to engage people. There are elements of that again, are overwhelming and distressing. Some are inspiring. At the end of the day, it was, I think, a pretty impressive case of how, especially in the sustainability space, you can turn this kind of volume of information that you're passionate about into a story that people actually can access and understand. So when Patty asked me to come in, I don't consider myself a queen of storytelling, by the way, but I'll try to do my best. I said, what would be your goal for me coming in to talk with people? And she said, well, if you can kind of equip everyone with feeling like they can really use stories in their work, to inspire and motivate as leaders in sustainability, that would be awesome. And I'm like, if I could do that in 15 minutes, that would be awesome. You're right, because I do this over the course of months and years even. It's a practice. I think one of the things that people often also forget is that we tell stories all the time. It's actually how we communicate. I mean, especially think about as a parent, right? You tell your kid. You don't say, if you step off that cliff, you might fall 80 feet and break both legs. You say, bad things happen, like when you step off a cliff. Have you ever seen Roadrunner? It doesn't actually happen like that in the real life. We use stories all the time, and I think that that's something people forget. They think that storytelling is this intellectual practice that's over here and I'll never know enough about to be good at. But the reality is we do it all the time. So what I'm going to do is offer you one of the biggest insights that drove the work that I did when I was at Free Range Studios, but also is used in just stories that are successful, the ones that we remember and retell over time. I'll give you one kind of big strategic insight, and then I'm going to give you a handful of kind of tactical things to think about, some of which we've touched on today, which is great as well. So the big one of the things that we discovered, or I think we've all probably observed too, right? Like, you get a lot of communications that come at you, whether it's a sustainability space or the greenwashing version of sustainability space, or just the more traditional marketing communications, right? We get 5,000 messages a day. The first thing we try to figure out is how to delete and ignore most of them, right? So some resonate, some cut through. Usually they're not the ones that say, you suck unless you do this thing or unless you buy this thing, as opposed to saying, you're awesome if we do this thing together. So how do we unpack that, right? What we would offer, what I would offer anyway, is as you think about, especially in a leadership role, is the fact that you're not the hero of the story when you tell stories, right? None of us want to say, like, I'm amazing, follow me. But people love it when you say, you could be amazing, we could be amazing together, and I'm here to help you do that. So that would be the first kind of major insight, is this idea that you're not the hero of the story. You're really there to function as a mentor to the staff you're delegating to the audience you're trying to inspire. You're there to help them become more of who they want to be in the world and call on the values that you share together. And again, this is not stuff that we're making up out of thin air, but are people familiar with Joseph Campbell? Is anyone here familiar with Joseph Campbell? I'm getting some good nods. So Joseph Campbell was a scholar. He studied stories across faiths, time, thousands of years, because he was trying to understand, like, why do some stories just last? Why do we see the same story in Native American myth that we see in the Quran, that we see in the Bible? Why is it that some of these stories just keep manifesting in certain ways? And what he deduced from that was this framework, this monomyth called the hero's journey. And if people haven't heard of Joseph Campbell, you've probably heard of Star Wars, right? So what a lot of people don't necessarily know is that George Lucas wrote 2 versions of that script that he shopped all over Hollywood. People were like, what, science fiction, bad guys and the things on our head, what, I don't get it. He wrote these 2 scripts. Nobody wanted to pick it up. He got a hold of a copy of Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, flew Joseph Campbell out to Lucas Ranch, or Skywalker Ranch, and they wrote the Star Wars that you know today, literally using the hero's journey framework. They just plopped it right on there. So what are the traits of that, right? Luke Skywalker is the hero of the story. He doesn't start off as a hero. He starts off as a punk teenager who's annoyed and bored, and he's on his aunt and uncle's farm on some faraway planet, just bored out of his mind, until he meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, who says, so much more is possible. And you actually have the power to do that. I'm not going to do it all for you, but I'll give you a lightsaber, which is actually a really cool thing to have on hand. And I'll inspire you and motivate you to think that this crazy journey is actually possible. And so we have Star Wars. So I would just ask you, as you think about how do you use stories in your work as leaders in sustainability, framing yourself as the mentor and always thinking about your team, the audience you're trying to engage, as the potential heroes of that story, is just going to naturally resonate and carry beyond what you would get if you just delegate a task. Go do that thing. So that would be the strategic insight I would offer. So I have a handful of tactics, right? Like, what does that mean in terms of creating an actual story? Right? Inspire, especially in sustainability. And I would say inspire, but also be unreasonable. I don't know, are people familiar with Unilever's sustainability goals? Right, they're a huge leader in sustainability. Regardless of how you might feel about this mega corporation of hundreds of brands, literally. In 2010, they said, we're going to double our sales from a $40 billion company. We're going to have the ecological footprint of our raw materials, all the stuff we source, and we're going to touch a billion people with a message around sanitation and health. And they were like, and people were saying, how are you going to do that? That's insane. Like, people in the sustainability space were like, that's crazy. There's no way they can do that. And they were like, yeah, you're right. We don't know how we're going to do it. We're going to ask our massive pool of millions of people who work for us and all these brands to help us figure out how to do it. And so it wasn't even a direct, I think Patty asked a question. It's like, it was implicit authority. It's like, we're going to push this opportunity to innovate down to the line level and let people know this is the big story that we're trying to tell, and we're never going to reach it unless all of us try to do that. And they're actually on track. I mean, it was 2010, they're at like $58 billion as a company now. I mean, they're tracking to double, and they're tracking to have things. What that means is, like, suddenly a factory line manager at a Q-tip, the brand Q-tip, discovers a way to recycle all of the paper that they create in the administration of like the regional companies, and turns it into the stick in the Q-tip, which is completely neutralized. Like, a huge source of paper and just a whole distribution, a whole supply chain around that. It's not something that they would have ever designed in a supply chain, a sustainability manual. But it was this big story. We're going to double this stuff. We're going to have this stuff. We're going to touch 1 billion people. We don't know how. You know how. Let's do it together. It's imperative. It's a big story. It's interesting, and they're doing it. Establish empathy. Basic. So it's emotional intelligence, social intelligence. The best thing you can do in a story is say, I've been there. I know your barriers. I know your challenges. It seems really hard. And here's how I would go about it. Here are some tools or resources. But I have to understand where you're coming from. Create context. I want a who, what, when, where when you're telling a story. Make me see it, make me smell it, if it smells bad even, you know. Sometimes things don't smell great. Make me hear it. Bring that context to life for me so that I can drop in wherever you are. Balance the head and heart. We've heard that a couple times today, right? We're not just rational creatures. We're not just emotional creatures. But most of us are both of those things on some level. So you can't just shout at me about the 5 stages of the materials economy, but you can identify my role in that materials economy and make me understand that so that then you can deeply disturb me with the reality. Be positive, right? There's a ton of data that will prove to you that negative stories work. Fox News, right? We trigger fear, we trigger inadequacy. I'm sorry if anyone's a devout Fox News viewer. But you can trigger those things. You can get people to do a thing if you trigger fear, you trigger anxiety. Buy these jeans, you know, people will love you. Buy this car, and you'll be incredibly sexy and popular. But if you inspire people with what's possible by being positive and showing them positive examples, it goes so much further. You get much deeper engagement. You get affinity. They're like, I want to follow what that person's doing. It's just a fundamentally different tack. So when you think about stories, especially again in the sustainability space, it's so easy to tell the story of doom. The sky's falling, you know? But if you're positive and you're inspiring, it's just a much more, I want to step into that future that you think we can create together instead of that future we could avoid together. And then finally, invite action. So again, we've heard this, you know, David did a great job setting that up too. One of the things that we heard after Story of Stuff came out, so I'll also mention when Annie was in process of working on that script, and we said, okay, what's success look like? We would ask this of every client we worked with. What does success look like? She's like, if I could get 50,000 people to watch me talk about garbage, like everything I've learned about garbage for 10 years, if I get 50,000 people, I'd be so happy. And 36 hours after it launched, we were like, Annie, you must be so happy, because we've hit 36,000 people, and now, of course, it's reached over 10 million. It's in 26 languages. It was a moment in time. It was a resonant story. It was packaged in a way people could understand. They dove in. But what that movie didn't do, and I'll also say, at the time, there was really no, if you can even remember this, 2008, when it came out, 2007, actually, it was December of 2007, there was almost no long-form content. No one was watching shows on their computers. I mean, no one sat in front of a machine for 20 minutes to do anything. I mean, a computer to just watch uninterrupted video. So we weren't even sure if anyone was gonna, I mean, much less the fact that it's literally, you know, the story of garbage. But it's 22 minutes of a story about garbage. And people obviously watched it. What we didn't do in that movie, and what, in fact, it took high school students to point out to us in response videos were, Annie, this is amazing. We're so upset. And what do we do? And there was no what do we do. We were like, oh, let's make a whole network of stories, you know, create more stories that actually tell people what to do. Because when you give them this information and you give it to them in a digestible and accessible way, they want to take action. But you have to obviously ask them to do that.